I would like to bring the following report. Amen. Close quote. I thought McNulty's group were giving really good answers, answers that I could certainly agree with. And our group had some internal variety. And so I'm just going to report the news. We are just going to report the news. But question 1, 1123 to 30. We had a range of viewpoint. That 23 goes back to 161 BC. That's me. Goes back to 176 BC. I won't necessarily need to give the names. That it goes forward to AD 314. That it goes forward to AD 538. So there was a range of viewpoint. This is not where the group found its cohesion. We started coming into sync more toward the end of the passage. Then the hymn is, let's see, I thought the man's name was Lanus, but Popilius might be the, I think Gaius Popilius Lanus. In 168 BC, or him is the Nevzeh of 1121, or him is Constantine in AD 313. There was a spectrum of viewpoint. Do you have anything to add there?
Just one other comment. The idea of the flow of history had a bias already, acknowledging that it would go back to the Roman-Maccabean alliance of 161, or it would go forward to the time of Crusades or Inquisition, and that those are two views. Another view that was coming forward has to do with a segment of history between those two, after the crucifixion, after the cross, and before the formation of the papacy by 538. So another view that came up included, and there were several views about how that would happen historically, but it was around the time of the emperors from Constantine until Justinian. So that's another view that would fit in that slot that allowed for a continued forward motion of history that would still fulfill the letter of the descriptors in Daniel 11.
Yeah, in regard to whether history goes back or goes forward, as reported, we did not come to consensus. So number 2, 1136, and here we had, again, a number of viewpoints. The king goes back to 1131. The king goes forward to the Counter-Reformation, not the Reformation, but the Counter-Reformation after that. The king goes back to 1127 and from there to 1121, or the king goes back to AD, or goes forward, I guess, to AD 508 and Francis' war against the Visigoths, so we were all over the map. Anything to add?
Well, let me narrow the map just a little bit. The notion of 36 is transitional, and there was fair consensus that it began a description of a character relating to the papacy as that king, which would become the king of the north. And one point was that this comes after the Reformation, so it begins the Counter-Reformation, when the papacy began to gain momentum against Protestantism that it was losing ground to prior to that. So verse 36 becomes a time when the king does according to his will with the Counter-Reformation, that the papacy now gains strength during that era and comes forward from there to verse 40, when it is able to respond back to the push of the king of the south.
Which brings us to question number 3, 1140, define the time period, 1798. Question 4, 1140, who is the king of the north? The papacy.
And one quick comment.
Okay, sure.
And 1798 was acknowledged as a time frame from 1798 until Christ's second coming. That entire time frame is inclusive of the time of the end.
Right, the entire span is the period of the time of the end, but the time of the end has a beginning point, and that beginning point was 1798. Okay, question 4, the papacy. Question 5, revolutionary France, 1798. Anything to add there?
Yeah, one point there.
Okay.
which is it?
There's 5, the king of the south.
There are 2 points to verse 40. I just call them 40A, 40B. 40A, 1798, and the king of the south, atheistic France, which was actually a backlash to papal misperceptions of the gospel that allowed France to form its backlash to become atheistic. White is clear about that comment. So that the king of the south would come against or gall or push against the north in its capture of Pope Pius VI. But then there's a maturing in the second half of verse 40, where the north would be a combined effort of the papacy and apostate Protestantism, the beast and false prophet, coming against this other secular agency that is the South maturing into its final form that I would simply call professedly non-Christianity. Secular, religious, but non-Christianity, the dragon. And this conflict would have to go until a Sunday law was established, and then they coalesce as a confederation to come against God's people in Revelation 16:13.
And in verses 44 and 45.
Yeah.
Question number 6, 1140. To what or whom does him refer to in 1140? The king of the south attacks him, the king of the north. The king of the north responds against him. The king of the south, we saw 2 players in verse 40 and not 3. Question 7, 1145. Provide your interpretation for this verse. This was a difficult one to pull together. There were many viewpoints expressed, but basically we saw this as a siege around God's people, that we are now entering into the time of trouble. The attack is against the followers of God, and those who rescue them is the one who rescues them is Christ at his second coming.
Amen. And we acknowledge that the tabernacles of his palace, or the royal palace, the royal tabernacle, is both ecclesiastic and civil, as the papacy is wanting to represent Satan as man's God and man's king. And so that combination comes against the glorious holy mountain Zion, God's remnant at the end of time, and plants his tabernacle and his palace between humanity and God's people, to prevent them from hearing that last day message that they can be converted to come out of her, my people.
That's it.
Thank you. All right, so, thank you. If you have any questions or comments, I think that a summary would be that what you heard in the previous presentation was very similar to the conclusions, general thoughts of your group as well.
It was very similar to my conclusions. The group was very diverse.
All right, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll just take a couple of comments, gentlemen. Brother Don, back there.
So, do you believe that war took place in 1798?
The attack on the papacy was prosecuted by an army carrying weapons in their hands. It was a literal thing with literal armies.
So what does the word push mean?
It means, the word is yitnagah, and that means to gore. That is the primary lexical entry. When you look it up in the lexicon, the primary meaning of that of nagah in the Hitpael stem is to gore. And one important thing about that word is that it is singular. Now there is a preposition, he will gore with him, so that sounds mutual, but the verb is singular. Only one power is doing the goring. That was not a mutual contest, that was a mauling.
But, so it's not, it doesn't have to be a war, just marching with arms would suffice.
Well, it wouldn't have to be with armies, but it was. So, you know.
Okay, what I hear you say is the text can allow for different interpretations.
Well, there was some kind of aggressive action, and you know, if you accept that Napoleon was the one behind it, it was with armies.
All right, thank you. Okay, yes, Brother Ken?
Yeah, what information in light does Daniel 11:45 give us that we don't already know from some other prophecies in the Bible?
That is a precious question. I love that question. Yeah, because it implies that Daniel is saying the same thing as Revelation. Oh, what do we learn from Daniel 11:45 that we didn't know from other sources? That's wonderful. That implies to me that Daniel's saying the same things as John. And to that, we could add the reality check of the spirit of prophecy. But to answer your question, we have much of that information in Revelation. I would want to reflect on that.
No, the answer is that he wants to reflect on it.
Is that okay if he not doesn't answer the question?
I think the question is that Brother Frank is being honest with us that he wants to reflect more on that. Rather have honest reflection and
Yeah, if I'm going to give an answer to that, I want to give a good answer, and I don't feel that I can right now.
Okay, one final question before I pass Ed there.
It was just a comment related to that discussion, so if you want to take a different one, that's fine.
All right. Okay. Wait.
I was just wanting to get a clarification. I didn't hear for question 6, the hymn of verse 40. Could you just clarify that?
Well, the hymn of verse 40, there are 2 hymns in verse 40. Now, it's the same Hebrew form, but it's referring to 2 different individuals in our view. We saw 2 players in verse 40. The first hymn was the king of the north that the king of the south attacked. The king of the south attacked him, and then the king of the north responded against him, the king of the south.
And you understand the king of the north to be the pagan?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, brethren, for your input. It's
Thank
very,
you.